Hi, in this part of my divorce story, I would like to share a bit more of dealing with losses. Some of the feedback I've been getting is that when they hear the title divorce story, they typically are kind of thinking along the line of the marriage story that Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver was performing, where there's a lot of conflict and back and forth. I think in my case, it's a little bit more boring, but maybe not less interesting, I hope. At the same time, where there's less conflict and more about talking about my personal way of dealing with this very emotional process. I mentioned in my previous video that it's really not the main point to assign blame. I think they're all things that we can claim responsibility for, and they're places where we can feel hurt by what has happened or what the other person has done, both out of their own self-protection or simply not knowing what to do. So we can all own some of the hurt and some of the hurting. But at the end of the day, it's a loss for everyone involved. It's a loss for me going through this process of physical separation, moving out. It's a loss for my daughter, who no longer, has this complete family where two parents are together, more times than we are right now. And certainly, I believe a loss for my partner, who also didn't necessarily, happily go through this process, but also in the end decided this was the best for him as well. But, I talk about loss because that's really essentially what it is. And I just got off a call with another fellow therapist, and it really felt good to listen to each other and to be listened to, and sharing the losses that as we go through life, we accumulate. Excuse me, that's a little bit my psychosomatic kind of blocking of the throat, and some of the emotions are coming through. And, I'm usually a much more of a cerebral person, so it had used to be very hard for me to even cry during my own therapy with my therapist. But these days, I notice it's a lot easier for me to feel tearful and to let the emotions come through. Partly because there is a lot of emotions, grief, but also partly because I think I'm much more unhindered or unblocked from some of the pressure of holding things in before. And of course, this is an experiment for me to be vulnerable, to not be afraid to appear imperfect and simply sometimes at a loss for words. And all of that is very uncomfortable. But losses are unfortunately a necessary part of life. And a common theme I even noticed as I chat with fellow sojourner in life and noticing the losses is how much that sometimes as we grow, that we start having a little bit more conflict with people we hold dear, not just our partners, but our best friends for 20, 30 years, our parents, our mentors, people that we still very much love and cherish, but realize that certain old coping mechanism, or the way they survive, the way they cope with panic, the way they deal with anxiety are no longer suitable for the way that we live. And I think that's part of growing, is to be able to be strong enough to survive the loss, to be willing to let go, to be willing to accept that certain separations are necessary in order for us to move forward. And part of my reason for separation was to accept that my own awareness of my needs and in reaching out for support and in wanting to connect at a deeper level doesn't necessarily suit what the developmental needs is for my partner. And there's not necessarily a better or worse, or who's faster, who's slower. I think it's really a circle of life in some way, that we all grow at different stages at different time, and sometimes they just don't line up. I say that with, certain ease, but it's not an ease that comes natural. It's practiced. It's done with a lot of tears that have been shed. And I think in allowing myself to connect with that loss, and allowing myself to show tears, and not be afraid that it will be confused with fragility or weakness, which inevitably some people will, is a big step for me. So here is my sharing that loss with you, because I know that whether you're going to a separation or not, or simply just going through other key developmental stages in life, there are inevitably losses. Whether you are someone who are going through the rise of teenage years and leaving home to go to college, or you're someone who is newly fresh out of a career where you decided there was no suitable for you, or simply leaving a long-term romance that no longer served you, or even seeing your child leaving home, pursuing his next stage of life. There's a lot of loss that we, no matter how positive we are, we cannot deny that it's a difficult process. And part of my loss in allowing my daughter to have more physical separation from me, because she has an equal right, and just as dad has an equal right to spend time with her, to really be accepting that we each have something to give to our daughter. And no matter what my anxiety, fear, or sometimes loneliness might be, it cannot be put in front of her need to get her resources and learning and empathy and mirroring from both parents. Even if there's things that are imperfect that I'm worried about, then there's equally that possibility with me. And I have to trust her ability to sift out ultimately what really suits her, because she has a natural algorithm in her body that will allow her to realize, what is important to absorb and what important to leave behind. And when she needs me, I know she will let me know, and I will be there to observe and offer, but not expecting that it will necessarily be accepted. I often say that the biggest part of parenting is about knowing when to get out of the way. And I know, especially being very different constitutionally and temperamentally from my daughter, I cannot let my own anxiety, or maybe sometimes even certain grandiosity about what I could do better, overshadow what truly that she might know is better for her, and really listen to her. And kids, no matter how young, really have an innate sense of what's suitable for them. And even if they don't recognize something in the moment, they will come back and let us know, as long as we give them the safety and the space. So I talk about loss because, there's so much loss of that sort of physical presence and connection and companionship, even from my daughter, even though it's not her job to provide that for me. But when you're in the same household, it's naturally that we are providing companionship for each other, which has also been reduced. But in many ways, it allows her to have space to grow in her own way. And in connecting with the loss and just allowing myself to feel the pain and the daily heaviness, I'm beginning to be more accepting of the different colors of emotion that come up without necessarily reacting to it. And this really is what emotional regulation is. And to be certain, emotional regulation is never about denying that emotion. Because there's so much of what we learn unconsciously or sometimes consciously from the people who brought us up is that somehow admitting we have that emotion or even feeling that emotion is the same as acting it out or behaving in such a way that makes us emotional or irrational. That's simply not the truth. It's true that when people don't know how to handle their emotion, they can act out, they confuse the emotion with the behavior. But really, ultimately, if we learn that we can separate those two things, we can feel all of these emotions and still be in complete good management, rational management of our behavior. I feel sadness, happiness, fatigue, frustration, anger, which is something I want to elaborate a little bit more on, embarrassment, shame, fear, all the time. I think the difference is that we don't necessarily, having learned how to regulate and recognize that, observe that, and not necessarily be taken over by it, means I don't necessarily act out by, having those translate into my behavior. And that's so important as we talk to people around us, because when they express emotions, it's totally okay. We're not responsible for it. We can show empathy, but we're not responsible for making them feel better. We don't have to be afraid of their emotions. And ultimately, we're all responsible for regulating ourselves, for bringing our emotions to a neutral place eventually. But in the process, I'm allowed to have tears. I'm allowed to share with you that I'm feeling this way. I'm allowed to sit on the sofa and be in a little bit of a sad days, because I trust and know that I'll bounce back up. But having had that process, then I can allow that energy to dissipate and renew myself again. And I want to talk a little bit about anger, and hopefully I won't go as long as last time. But what's striking me today is yesterday I went to my kickboxing class. This is something I started a couple months ago. And I realized as I work with clients and myself that one of the commonly forbidden emotion, implicitly or explicitly by society, is rage and anger, in particular for women, because we're supposed to be, gentle, smiley, and kind, and caretaking. And I think it's particularly scary to feel rage or anger, because it denotes violence, implies that something violent might happen. But that's only true if we confuse our emotion with our behavior. As I mentioned during this whole process, I had a lot of, anger and rage. And I admit at first, sometimes that's directed at what was lacking in our marriage and my partnerships. So sometimes I can be displaced onto my partner as a person. But ultimately, my rage and anger is about seeing how, as a human race and as a modern society, the gender roles has really in many ways victimized all of us. The patriarchy, the chauvinism that we're all responsible for, but yet we cannot blame one particular person for all of it. It's because we're all participant. And the reason why I say that I have rage and anger towards that is I've seen so many patterns, whether in my family, in my own marriage, where this assumption what women should do and what men should do has really doomed us to separation and conflict and lack of connection, lack of empathy. I once read somewhere when I was studying developmental stages that if we're kind of just simply talking about in the traditional binary system, women's growing up process is addition, meaning we grow up to be young women and we're expected to add makeup, add jewelry, add pretty clothes, pretty smile, maybe even high heels, and then dress nice, and then become moms, become good mom at home, good wife, and in addition to be a professional, and then maybe later on be a caretaker for the elderly. So there's unending adding of roles and continues having to be multitasking and being perfect. And it doesn't mean the man, or again, using a very limited binary system in the traditional society, where it doesn't mean man somehow is the winner. On the surface, sometimes it can appear they are in charge of things, have more power, they make more money. There are a superficial layer of benefit. But ultimately, the reverse is true, that for a man, we're born really, except for certain biological truths, are not that different from women. They're capable of a lot of empathy, connections, and a lot of different talents that are then forced to be reduced as they grow. That for a man, the developmental process is a process of reduction. You become a teenager, you're even less allowed to cry and show emotions than when you were a boy, and then you're supposed to be strong and focus on the traditional bread earning role, and then your soul identity then get invested in your status, how much you make, the power and the ability to provide for your family, and the ability not to show emotions. And then gradually that becomes the identity they live in, and that becomes the bubble that then cuts them off from their family, from connecting, from showing up, because it's not safe to have those aspects that are really society has told them to disown. And I see my male clients, whether through couples therapy or individual therapy, that so many of them are also just yearning for connection. But they never had the tools to show, and they never had developed the tolerance for emotions from other people. And they're scared and they're lonely, and they might resort to a substance, not because they're terrible or undisciplined people. Often they're highly functional, loving people, but they don't know how else to ask what they need, which is another thing they had to reduce in their identity, which is not to show need, not to show vulnerability in any way. So the only way they can feel connected or wanted is by using substance, watching pornography, or other things where it's a quick release, but never truly resolve what they're lacking inside. So we're all suffering from this. And that's where my anger, my at times rage that really sends me into sobbing sessions is about. That we're all unfortunately victimized by that traditional binary system that's not just about gender or gender identity or sexual identity, but it's very much about the nuances of everyday life, how we connect, how are we allowed to show up, how are we allowed to feel, how are we allowed to behave. And that's why I intentionally have encouraged myself and set myself up to express, have a healthy outlet, of course, to express more aggressive emotions, such as anger and fear and even rage. And that's why I use boxing as an outlet to let some of that out, to constructively allow myself to express. And I also have, as some of you might know, a screaming machine where I could scream into it, but it doesn't necessarily disturb the neighbor. So I guess I am reclaiming some of the things I've lost, and shedding some of the things that I've gained that was not necessary, in hopes that while I can't change others, I'm hoping by example, by being willing to undergo the pain of pushing some of my boundaries to experience new things and to reclaim things I've lost, I am setting that example, or at the very least, by changing myself, I create certain ripple effect, like a pebble in a quiet lake. Of course, it's not a quiet lake because I know so many others out there are doing it. Women, men, challenging the traditional status quo in their own way, bravely doing one small step at a time, and that's what inspires me. So in sharing the loss and the feeling of this, I'm hoping that you see much more than just my sadness or heaviness, but the courage and the hope and the resilience that in feeling, in allowing ourselves to accept some of the losses, we're actually re-energizing ourselves for more gain, for bravely to keep up the hope and the positivity that there's always more that we can learn and grow, even as we feel hurt and the grief of the loss. So I might actually, in a little bit of maybe self-validation, I will share a little bit of my very amateurish kickboxing video, and I hope that you get a kick out of some of that kind of energy release. And if you're not into kickboxing or any of that, I often just say, even just thrashing around a pillow, allow ourselves to have a muffled scream in a contained environment is a very healthy and perfectly acceptable way to release some of that energy that's been accumulated that might be part of all the emotions we experience. And thank you very much for being here again in another day of my divorce story. But it's really ultimately, maybe I feel like maybe I've mistitled it because so many times people associate divorce as a very negative thing. But I guess I want to see it more as a kind of a self-splitting and growing and becoming separate but healthier individual kind of story. It's an individuation story, because not only are we supposed to individuate from our parents, but actually in attaching to a partner, sometimes we're replicating certain patterns from our childhood. In some ways, leaving that partnership or marriage is another layer to our individuation, so that we can be more ready for connection that's not about need, but it's more about want and respect and mutual support. Take care until next time, and thanks for listening.